Hey guys, tonight we are going to look into the darkness at the heart of the world's favourite sport. Imagine the sound. Not the roar of a stadium, but the acidic hiss of a flare arcing over the pitch, disappearing into a fog of coloured smoke. Imagine the crack of a plastic seat breaking against bone, a sea of faces contorted not in joy but in a kind of ritualistic ancestral rage. This isn't a story about diving or bad referee calls. This is about hatred so old it has its own holidays. And honestly, if you were dropped into the middle of some of these, you probably wouldn't survive the walk to the parking lot. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. As always, I'd love to see where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city or country and what time it is for you in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It was Pelé, the Brazilian king, who famously christened it O Jogo Bonito, the beautiful game. And it can be transcendence. It can be 90 minutes of choreographed art that makes millions of people, from boardrooms to barrios, feel the exact same spike of joy at the exact same second. It's a universal language, a force for good. It's the Christmas truce of 1914, where German and British soldiers famously laid down their rifles in no man's land to kick a ball around. That's the version we sell, that's the myth. But tonight, we're looking at the mirror image, the shadow. Because football is also a tribal identifier, more potent than a passport and more sacred than a holy book. And when tribes gather, they draw lines, and where there are lines, there is war. The core unsettling truth is that football doesn't create the hate. It never has. It's just a container. A perfect 105 by 68 metre grass and chalk box to pour all the existing societal poisons into. Class warfare, political ideology, ancient religious schisms, and simple, ugly geographical spite. Football just gives these ancient hatreds a scoreboard and a set of team colours. It's society's most honest friend, the one who shows up, drinks all your coffee and tells you that, yes, those genes do make you look like you've given up on life. It just holds up the mirror and says, this is you. This is what you actually care about. And often, what we care about is finding a group of people to despise. This isn't new. This is primal. Long before the multi-billion-dollar stadiums and the slow-motion replays, there was a thing in medieval England called mob football. This wasn't a sport. It was a ritualised riot. Entire villages would go to war over a pig's bladder, with the goal being to move the bladder to the rival village's church, often miles away. There were no rules. Hundreds of men would brawl, trample and break bones over this object for an entire day. It was, basically, the purge. But with more mud and less interesting masks. King Edward II actually banned it in 1314, not because it was violent. Violence was just Tuesday back then. But because it was distracting his subjects from practicing their archery for actual state-sanctioned wars. The impulse to gather, to identify another, and to engage in symbolic, and often very real, violence over a ball is as old as the hills. We've just gotten better at selling tickets for it. Analysts still argue whether the stadium environment creates a unique mob psychology, a temporary madness that seizes thousands, or if it simply gives a large crowd permission to express the divisions and animosities they already feel. Does the stadium make the man a monster? Or does the monster just wait all week for the stadium? The answer, depressingly, seems to be yes to both. The crowd offers anonymity. The ritual offers justification. Suddenly, a mild-mannered accountant, a father of 3, is screaming threats of such magnificent anatomical creativity at a 20-year-old kid in a different coloured shirt that it would make a sailor blush. He doesn't hate the player. He hates the shirt, and he hates the shirt because it represents the other side of the city, the other kind of person, the other god. This organisation of hate finds its modern voice in the ultra movement. It's a mistake to lump them in with the classic English hooligan of the 1980s, who was often just about the fight and the beer. The ultra phenomenon, born in Italy, is different. It's about performance. It's about choreography. They are the 12th man, but not just in spirit. They see themselves as an extension of the club's identity. They paint the tifos, those stadium-sized banners of breathtaking artistry. They coordinate the flares, the smoke, the songs that last for 90 minutes without a break. It's like being in a very aggressive, poorly dressed musical, where the main song is just threatening the other side's choreography. But this dedication, this fanatical militaristic organisation, has a terrifyingly dark side. Because if your entire identity is wrapped up in the performances of support, then what happens when you're challenged? What happens when you meet your mirror image from across the city? The performance of love for your club becomes a performance of hatred for theirs. The rivalries that curdle into something truly disturbing are the ones that tap into these pre-existing fault lines. When the game is no longer about the game, when it's a proxy for something deeper, it can be class. This is the story of Buenos Aires, a tale of the millionaires who moved to a rich neighbourhood and the manure handlers who stayed by the dirty port. It can be politics. This is the story of Belgrade, where the stadiums became recruiting grounds for paramilitary warlords, and the fans went from chanting against rivals to chanting for ethnic cleansing. It's the story of Cairo, where the organised fan groups became so powerful they helped to overthrow a government, and then paid a terrible price for it. And then there is the oldest, deepest, and most venomous crack in the human psyche, the one that has launched 1,000 wars and built empires on bones: religion. What happens when a 90-minute football match becomes a proxy war for God? What happens when every tackle is a theological debate and every goal is a strike against a heretic? To find that, you have to go to a city of stone and rain, a city divided by a belief in the same God but a different way of kneeling, a city where the two biggest teams are not just teams but symbols of a centuries-old schism that has defined a nation. The rivalry is so old, so ingrained, they just call it the old firm, and it is perhaps the most toxic, entrenched, and dangerous fixture in all of world football. The hatred is so pure, it's almost impressive. It's where we must begin. We find ourselves in Glasgow, a hard city built from industrial smoke, iron, and a particular kind of stubborn, damp cold that gets into your bones. It's a city of brilliant art and cutting humour, but it's also a city nursing a wound that never, ever heals. It is the city of the old firm. And to understand the old firm, you must first understand that for vast swathes of its population, who do you support is not a question about football. It's a question about God, your ancestors, your politics, and which side of a centuries-old divide you were born on. It's Celtic versus Rangers, green versus blue, the Irish tricolour versus the Union Jack, Catholic versus Protestant. This isn't a rivalry. It's a schism, played out with studs on. To find the poisoned root, you have to go back to the 19th century. Glasgow was the second city of the empire, a booming, sprawling, filthy industrial heartland. Its shipyards on the River Clyde built the world's greatest ships, and its factories belched smoke and profit. It was also a city of brutal poverty, of overcrowded, disease-ridden tenements, and into this simmering pot came a new ingredient: people. Specifically, hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine. They were desperate, they were starving, and crucially, in predominantly Presbyterian Scotland, they were Catholic. They settled in the city's poorest East End, bringing with them their music, their culture, and their faith. They were met with suspicion, prejudice, and open hostility from the established Scottish working class, who saw them as a threat, a wave of cheap labour undercutting wages and taking jobs. The sectarian tensions that had plagued Ireland and Scotland for centuries were no longer an abstract theological debate. They were a bitter, daily struggle for survival in the same slums. This is the world that gave birth to Celtic Football Club. In 1887, a Marist brother named Walfrid, from St Mary's Church in the East End, had an idea. He saw the abject poverty of his Irish Catholic flock and wanted to help. His mission was simple: to raise money for a charity called the Poor Children's Dinner Table, and his method, inspired by the success of other clubs, was to found a football team. Celtic Football Club was created quite literally to feed the hungry. The club's name, its four-leaf clover crest, and its adoption of the green and white hoops were all a proud, unambiguous celebration of its Irish and Catholic roots. It was an institution built to give a marginalised, impoverished community a sense of belonging, a source of pride, and a hot meal. And then there was Rangers. This is the quirky, fringe tidbit that often gets lost in the toxic fallout. Rangers, founded in 1872, were not sectarian. They weren't political. They were just four young lads, Moses McNeill, his brother Peter, Peter Campbell and William Macbeath, who saw a group of men playing football on Glasgow Green and fancied a go themselves. Their name was supposedly lifted from an English rugby club's annual they'd thumbed through. For their first decade and a half, Rangers were just a football club. Their identity was blue, and their primary concern was simply playing the game. The change began when Celtic arrived and almost immediately succeeded. Celtic's mission and its powerful emotive identity were a magnet for the Irish Catholic diaspora, not just in Glasgow but across Scotland. They were a phenomenon, and the established Protestant working class of Glasgow looked on, felt their own sense of identity threatened, and sought a champion to reflect their values. They found it in the light blue of Rangers. Historians still argue whether the transformation of Rangers into the Protestant club was a cynical, deliberate move by the club's directors to capture the other half of the city's massive divided fan base, or if it was an organic grassroots movement from the supporters themselves. The truth, as it usually does, likely lies in a messy combination of both. What is certain is that by the 1890s the lines were drawn. Rangers became the club of loyalism, a fierce loyalty to the British Crown and the Protestant faith. Their stadium, Ibrox, became a sea of Union Jacks and Red Hands of Ulster. The rivalry quickly became known as the Old Firm. This nickname itself is a point of contention. The most popular origin story, and a fine piece of contemporary sarcasm, is that it came from a newspaper cartoon or article in the early 1900s. With both clubs dominating Scottish football and playing each other so often in the league, in the cup, in local cups, their fixtures became the primary financial engine of the entire sport in Scotland. They were partners in profit. They were a firm. They needed each other. And the more they played, the more their mutual profitable hatred calcified. This wasn't just terrace banter. It was a reflection of a city where your last name, the school you went to, or the street you lived on could determine your lot in life. The shipyards of Govan and Clydebank, the industrial heart of the city, were infamously segregated. Signs reading "Catholics need not apply" were a common, unspoken reality. Rangers adopted this principle with grim enthusiasm, instituting an unofficial but rigidly enforced no Catholics signing policy. For decades, to wear the blue of Rangers, you had to be a Protestant. It wasn't just a tradition, it was a core part of the club's identity, a promise to their supporters. Celtic, conversely, never had an official no Protestants policy. Their legendary captain, and first ever captain, James Kelly, was Protestant. But by virtue of their founding, their name and their symbols, they were the de facto Catholic club. If you were from the Irish Catholic community, Celtic was your blood, your faith, your family. The rivalry became a stand-in for this social and economic apartheid, some mainstreamer historical fact. From this era is the sheer dominance the two clubs established. Since the Scottish Football League began in 1890, the Old Firm has won the title 109 times as of 2024. All other clubs combined, 19. They didn't just harness the city's division, they devoured the entire sporting landscape of a nation, fueled by the money and passion of their two warring tribes. So as the 19th century bled into the 20th, the stage was set. This was no longer a game. It was a biannual ritual, a 90-minute proxy for a centuries-old conflict. There was a place for men who worked brutal, back-breaking weeks in the shipyards and factories to release the pressure of a deeply divided, unjust and often violent society. They would gather in their tens of thousands, separated by a thin line of police, to scream at their neighbours, their co-workers, their fellow Glaswegians. They were screaming about God, about Ireland, about the Crown, about jobs. And as the crowds grew larger and the stakes felt higher, it was only a matter of time before the screams, the songs and the hatred turned physical. The Ibrox terraces in particular were becoming a place of immense structural danger, a tinderbox of concrete and humanity waiting for a spark. The pressure had to go somewhere. All that compressed hatred, that daily grind of sectarianism, that inherited duty to despise the other, it couldn't be contained by a referee's whistle. And so, the terraces became a cauldron of genuine physical menace. The songs became viler, the chants more explicit, no longer just about the game, but about the famine, the Pope, the King, the Easter Rising, and with the songs came the weapons. It was not uncommon for fans to arrive tooled up, pockets full of coins to be thrown as missiles, darts, sharpened combs, and in the dark days of Glasgow's infamous razor gangs in the 1920s and 30s, knives and cutthroats. This was the era of No Mean City, a time when Glasgow's hardman reputation was forged in blood. Going to the Old Firm was less going to the football and more enrolling in a very disorganised short-term militia. The stadiums themselves were structurally unequipped for this volume of humanity and this level of venom. They were vast, echoing bowls of wood and packed earth, designed to hold the maximum number of standing bodies with the minimum amount of cost or, frankly, thought. Safety standards were suggestions at best. It was more, let's hope the wood holds, than a coherent structural plan, and in 1902 at Ibrox Park the wood did not hold. This is the quirky or fringe tidbit yammed that forms the first dark chapter of Ibrox's history. The first great stadium disaster in Britain didn't even happen at an Old Firm game. It was April 5th, 1902, during the annual Scotland vs England match. A new sprawling wooden terrace, the West Tribune, had been built to accommodate the massive crowd. It was packed. Heavy rain the night before had soaked the pine, weakening its integrity. 20 minutes into the match, with over 70,000 people crammed inside, a section of the flooring gave way. It was a clean, horrific snap. Hundreds of spectators fell over 40 feet onto the concrete and steel supports below. The game, infamously, was stopped. The dead and dying were laid out on the pitch, and, in a moment of baffling Victorian stoicism, the match was eventually restarted, lest the remaining tens of thousands of spectators riot. 25 people died. Over 500 were injured. The stadium was rebuilt. The wooden terraces were replaced with solid earth banking, but the place was marked. It had a ghost, and as the decades wore on, the Old Firm rivalry only deepened, digging its claws further into the city's soul. The signing of Mo Johnston in 1989, the first high-profile Catholic to sign for Rangers since before World War I, is often cited as the breaking of the sectarian barrier. But it wasn't a moment of healing. It was a trauma. Rangers fans burned their scarves and season tickets in protest. Celtic fans called him Judas for joining the enemy. It proved the point. The football was secondary. This was about identity. This simmering pot of bile defined the matchday experience. For decades, the ritual was the same. The long walk to the stadium, the segregation of fans, the thick wall of police. The air itself felt different, electric, toxic, heavy. These were not people politely discussing the offside trap. They were there to wage a 90-minute war on behalf of their grandfathers. And the stadiums, particularly Ibrox, remained dangerously antiquated. The earth-banked terraces were now crisscrossed with concrete stairways. One, in particular, at the northeast corner of the stadium, Stairway 13, was a known bottleneck. It was a steep, narrow, menacing chute of concrete. January 2nd, 1971. The New Year's Old Firm Derby. It was a bitter, cold, foggy afternoon. Over 80,000 people were crammed into Ibrox. The game itself was a dull, tense, nervy affair, typical of the fixture. As the clock ticked towards 90 minutes, it was 0-0. Celtic, in the dying moments, looked to have snatched it. Jimmy Johnston scored 0-1 to Celtic. The Rangers' end, crammed onto the massive Copey Terrace, began to empty. Thousands of dejected fans turned and headed for the exits, many of them heading towards Stairway 13. And then, the impossible happened. In the very last seconds of stoppage time, Rangers equalised. Colin Stein hooked the ball into the net, 1-1. The stadium exploded in a sound that was half joy, half rage, and this is where the mystery and the horror truly begin. Commentators still argue whether the roar for Colin Stein's late goal truly caused the fatal surge on Stairway 13, or if the crush was an inevitable, tragic accident already in motion. The long-held myth is that the fans who were leaving heard the roar, stopped, and tried to turn back to get a glimpse of the celebration. They collided with the people still pushing up from behind, creating a catastrophic human pile-up. Other survivors, however, swear the crush had already begun before. The goal, that it was a simple, horrifying case of too many people trying to leave through too narrow an exit at the exact same time, and someone, somewhere, simply fell. The result was the same. A man fell, then another fell on top of him, then a woman, then a child. In seconds, the narrow concrete chute of Stairway 13 became a tangled, screaming mass of bodies, piled 10 feet high. The pressure was so immense people were suffocated where they stood. The steel barriers designed to control the crowd bent like wire, becoming part of the trap. Police and rescuers who arrived on the scene could do nothing. The pile was so dense, so intertwined, that it was impossible to pull anyone free. They could only wait for the pressure to subside, listening to the screams fade. The mainstream historical fact is the final sickening toll: 66 dead. Most of them were under 30. The youngest was 8 years old. It was at the time the worst disaster in the history of British football. The city of Glasgow for once was united, not in victory, but in absolute profound and shattered grief. Green and blue, scarves were wrapped around the same lampposts. Celtic players and staff attended the funerals alongside their Rangers counterparts. For a moment, the rivalry seemed petty, the hatred obscene. The disaster forced a complete rethink of stadium safety in Britain. Ibrox was torn down and rebuilt into a modern all-seater stadium, its vast, dangerous terraces finally banished to history. The 1971 Ibrox disaster was a tragedy born of architecture, of negligence, and of sheer numbers. But it happened in the context of the old firm, a fixture that demanded such vast numbers, that generated such a desperate, crushing intensity that 80,000 people would risk being packed like sardines on a freezing day, all for the chance to scream at their neighbours. The hatred didn't cause the crush, but it created the conditions for it. It was the poison in the air. The rivalry had claimed its victims not with a knife or a bottle, but with the simple, brutal physics of a crowd. The feud, however, was too old, too deep. The grief faded, but the colours remained. The blood on the terraces was a scar, but it wasn't a cure. The rain-soaked sectarian bitterness of Glasgow fades, and we are transported halfway across the world to a place of heat, of passion, of stake, and of tango. We are in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a city that lives and breathes football with an intensity that is, frankly, a little frightening. This city is home to what the Observer once called the #1 sporting event you must see before you die. It's not a compliment about its safety, it is the Superclásico, and it is a rivalry born not of God, but of gold and mud. This is the story of Boca Juniors versus River Plate, a feud that splits a city and a nation right down the middle based on the oldest grudge of all, class. If the old firm is a vertical divide of faith, the Superclásico is a horizontal one of class. It's the dock workers versus the doctors, the grit of the slums versus the elegance of the suburbs, the people versus the establishment. To understand it, we have to go back to the beginning of the 20th century to the docks of La Boca. This was the city's port, a poor, rough, vibrant neighbourhood. It was the entry point for millions of immigrants, particularly from Italy, and even more specifically from Genoa. They were the Zenaises, Ondius, the Genoese, a nickname that sticks to this day. They were working class, they were tough, and they lived in the colourful tin-roofed houses of the Caminito. In this same bubbling industrial pot of mud and sweat, two clubs were born. In 1901, River Plate, and in 1905, just a few blocks away, Boca Juniors. This is the quirky, fringe tidbit that is so crucial. They were born in the same place, they were neighbours, they were brothers from the same working-class struggle. For their first 2 decades, they were just local rivals, scrapping it out in the same muddy port district. But then, in the 1920s, River Plate made a decision that would define Argentine football forever. They moved. They packed up and left La Boca, heading north to the wealthy, spacious, aristocratic suburbs of Núñez and Belgrano. This move was the rivalry's big bang. River Plate, by leaving, didn't just change its address, it changed its identity. It became the club of the affluent. This was cemented in the 1930s, the dawn of professionalism in Argentine football, when River went on an unprecedented spending spree. They brought forward Bernabé Ferreira for a fee that was, at the time, astronomical, earning them their eternal nickname, Los Millonarios, the Millionaires. Their stadium, El Monumental, reflects this. It's a vast, concrete, stately bowl, the national stadium, a place of order and scale. They represented the new, wealthy, European-facing Argentina. And Boca? Boca stayed. Boca remained in La Boca. They became the symbol of the working man, the immigrant, the person who stayed true to their roots. Their identity became El Pueblo, the people. Their stadium, La Bombonera, is one of the most sacred and intimidating buildings in all of sport. It's not a stadium, it's a cauldron. Its name means the chocolate box, a nickname given by its architect, who had received a box of chocolates with a similar upright D shape. It is a masterpiece of verticality, a three-sided wall of humanity that is so steep it's barely legal, with a fourth flat stand for VIPs that only emphasises the people's stands looming over them. Analysts still argue whether La Bombonera actually sways when the fans jump in unison, or if it's just a collective, terrifying optical illusion. Survivors of the experience insist it moves. It lives. It is the beating, vibrating heart of the working class. The insults the clubs use are the rivalry in miniature. River fans, looking at the dirty port and the nearby meat-packing plants, called Boca fans Los Bosteros, the manure handlers. It was a classist slur, meant to mock their poverty and the smell of their neighbourhood. The Boca fans, in typical working-class defiance, adopted it as a badge of honour. Yes, they said, we are the shit-shovelers, we are the grit, we have aguante. Aguante is a key concept. It means endurance, grit, the ability to suffer for your team, to stand and fight. Boca's retort, coined in the 1960s after River lost a dramatic Copa Libertadores final, was just as cutting. They called them gallinas, chickens. It implied that Los Millonarios were rich, elegant and technically skilled, but that when the pressure was on they were cowards. They had no heart, no aguante. And so, the battle lines were drawn for a century. Bosteros versus gallinas, mud versus gold, passion versus elegance, the people versus the rich. This isn't just a marketing gimmick. This philosophical divide dictated everything. Boca prided themselves on a style of play based on garra, claw, on struggle, on winning at all costs, embodied by uncompromising heroes. River prided themselves on La Nuestra, our way, a flowing, beautiful, almost artistic style of play. A victory for Boca was a victory for the common man. A victory for River was a victory for the establishment. And the mainstream historical fact is that this rivalry doesn't just divide a city, it colonizes an entire country. Polls consistently show that Boca and River, combined, command the loyalty of over 70% of all football fans in Argentina. You're either one or the other. There is no middle ground, no I just like the sport. This is a fundamental question of identity. Your family, your neighbourhood, your class, your philosophy, it's all bundled up in which set of colours you wear, and the atmosphere. It's not football, it's a carnival at the end of the world. The air is thick with papelitos, millions of pieces of shredded paper thrown from the stands, a blizzard of ticker tape that covers the pitch. The noise is a constant, percussive, primal roar, orchestrated by the Barras Bravas, the organised fan groups who are far more powerful and far more dangerous than their European counterparts. This isn't just cheering, it's a 90-minute sonic war. But when you mix this level of pure, unadulterated passion with this deep, century-old class resentment, you create an atmosphere of almost unbearable tension. Every tackle is a class statement, every goal is a political victory, and this pressure, this suffocation, this absolute need to win and to humiliate the other, has a dark, dark history. It's a passion that has, on more than one occasion, stopped being beautiful and started being fatal. The air in Buenos Aires, so thick with the papelitos and the percussive roar of the Barras Bravas, is also heavy with something else: pressure. It's the unbearable weight of a century of class warfare, the absolute non-negotiable demand for victory. And like the damp, packed terraces of Ibrox, that pressure must find an escape. Sometimes it escapes into violence, and on one cold, dark afternoon in 1968, it escaped into a tragedy so profound, so senseless, and so criminally unresolved that it haunts the Superclásico to this day. This is the story of the Puerta 12 tragedy, a disaster that confirmed every dark suspicion the working class of La Boca ever had about the establishment that despised them. We are at El Monumental, River Plate's vast concrete home. It is June 23, 1968. It is a cold, grey, damp winter's day. The Superclásico is, as it so often is, a tense, brutal and attritional affair. It is not, however, a thriller. It's a game of immense, passionate, bone-crunching nothing. A 0-0 draw. The kind of game that makes you wonder why you subjected yourself to 90 minutes of second-hand smoke, existential dread, and being screamed at by a man whose face is painted in a way that suggests a deep, unresolved argument with a mirror. The whistle blows, the anticlimax is heavy in the air. The Boca Juniors fans, the Bosteros, are gathered in their thousands in the away section. They're in enemy territory, the millionaire's palace of concrete. They're cold, frustrated, and they just want to go home. They begin to file out, shuffling from the open-air stands into the dark, steep concrete exit tunnels. Their designated exit is Puerta 1230, Gate 12, and this is where the timeline and the truth becomes a nightmarish contested fog. The procession of fans moves down the long, steep flight of stairs. It's dark in the tunnel, the light from the outside is a small, distant square. The crowd at the front of this human river slows, then stops. But the crowd at the back, still on the terraces, has no idea. They're still pushing, still shuffling, still just trying to get out of the cold. They pour into the tunnel, unaware that their comrades 100 feet ahead are now a wall. The physics of a human crush are not the physics of a stampede. No one is running. It is a slow, methodical, hydraulic compression. The tunnel becomes a solid block of humanity. People can't move their arms. They can't expand their chests to breathe. They're lifted off their feet, their ribs cracking, the air squeezed from their lungs. And still, the people at the back, hearing the first muffled screams, assume it's a fight or a celebration, and they keep pushing. It's the same horrifying mechanics as Stairway 13, but with a far more sinister and unresolved cause, because something or someone had blocked the exit. This is the central agonizing mystery. Historians and journalists still argue passionately about what, exactly, caused the blockage at Puerta 12. The official investigation, if you can call it that, was a whitewash. This was 1968, and Argentina was ruled by the military dictatorship of Juan Carlos Onganía. The military government, not exactly known for their "let's get to the bottom of this" plucky attitude, had no interest in a deep public investigation that might blame the police or the powerful president of River Plate. The case was closed with a shrug, blaming the fans themselves for collective hysteria, but the survivors and the Boca fans know this is a lie. There are three dominant, terrifying theories. The first, and most widely believed by Boca, is that the gates at the bottom of the tunnel were either locked or had been deliberately closed by stadium staff or police. It was an act of malice, a way to corral the Bosteros, to teach the manure handlers a lesson. The second theory is that the turnstiles, which should have been removed or locked open to allow an easy exit, were still in place and jammed, creating a fatal bottleneck that people were crushed against. The third theory is perhaps the most horrifying. It involves the mounted police. Some witnesses swore that the police, in a thuggish attempt to control the exiting Boca fans, charged their horses into the mouth of the tunnel. This created an immediate impenetrable wall of flesh, leather, and panicked horse flesh, into which the thousands of fans behind them were compressed. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The tunnel became a tomb. The Kesuru mainstream historical fact is the sickening final number, 71 dead. The average age of the victims was just 19. It was a massacre of children, of young fans who had gone to a football match and were squeezed to death in a dark concrete tube. Over 150 more were injured, many permanently. It remains the worst disaster in the history of Argentine football. The aftermath is what makes this story truly disturbing. It wasn't just a tragedy, it was a cover-up. No one was ever convicted. No one was ever held responsible. The clubs, River Plate and Boca Juniors, were sued for negligence. 2 years later, they were ordered to pay a compensation sum to the victims' families that was frankly an insult. The clubs were found negligent and fined a sum that, for the millionaires, probably amounted to a decent weekend catering budget. Worse still, the 71 families had to choose whether to accept this pathetic payout or pursue individual criminal charges. They couldn't do both. Most, left destitute by the loss of their sons, took the money. The case was dead. As a final, cynical act, River Plate's president, William Kent, the very man who had overseen the stadium's construction and was named in the lawsuit, simply retired the name Puerta 12. He changed the sign to Sector L. The gate was the same. The tunnel was the same. All that changed was a letter on the wall. This event poured pure, unadulterated poison into the rivalry. For Boca fans, This was no longer a class war fought with songs and insults. It was La Masacre de Puerta Twelves. It was murder. It was the rich, with the help of their police, killing the poor and getting away with it. It proved every paranoid suspicion, every dark whisper about what the establishment truly thought of them. The quirky, or in this case grotesque, tidbit comes from an investigation by the legendary sports magazine El Gráfico. A journalist using a pseudonym snuck into the sealed-off tunnel days later. He described the floor as a 3-inch thick viscous carpet of compressed clothing, shoes, wallets, personal items and human debris, all stuck together in a horrifying, unidentifiable paste. This tragedy became a scar, and like all scars in football, it was weaponized. It became a chant. Decades later, the most depraved elements of River Plate's Barras Brava would chant songs mocking the tragedy, telling Boca fans they died by the turnstiles. They would hold up pig, bosteros masks and make drowning, suffocating gestures. This is the darkness of the Superclásico. It's not just about football, it's not just about class. It's about 71 young ghosts trapped in a concrete tunnel and the horrifying, unforgivable fact that no one ever paid the price. The ghosts of Gate 12 did not bring peace. They did not chasten the rivalry. They became martyrs. Their unresolved deaths were not a lesson in the dangers of unchecked passion. They were proof, in the eyes of the bosteros, that the establishment wanted them dead. This unresolved trauma, this class-based animosity, this deep-seated feeling of us against the world didn't fade. It mutated. It metastasized. The 1970s and 80s in Argentina were a period of military dictatorship, the Dirty War, a time of state-sanctioned terror, disappearances and brutal oppression. And in this environment, a new, uniquely Argentine monster was born, the Barras Bravas. These are not ultras. They are not hooligans. The Barras Bravas are something else entirely, a group of gentlemen who make the old firm's hard men look like a particularly rowdy book club. Born from the most fanatical supporters, they were quickly co-opted by the clubs themselves, and even by the military junta. They were given tickets, given money, given travel, and in exchange they provided atmosphere. They were the beating heart of the stadium's passion. But they were also the regime's street muscle, used to intimidate political opponents or break up union meetings. Analysts still debate whether the Barras Bravas are a true fan phenomenon born of passion, or simply organised crime syndicates who use football as a convenient, emotionally charged front for their real business. The answer, as the dictatorship faded and democracy returned, became clear. They were a criminal enterprise. They controlled everything. They ran the ticket scalping, they controlled the parking lots, they ran the concession stands, they even extorted the club's own players, demanding donations for their loyalty, or threatening their families if they didn't play well, and most terrifyingly, they began taking percentages of player transfer fees. They were, in effect, part owners of the club, holding the actual presidents and board members hostage. Boca's Barra, La 12, the 12th man, and River's Los Borrachos del Tablón, the drunkards from the terraces, became two of the most powerful, wealthy and violent gangs in the country. This is the modern mayhem. The violence was no longer just between Boca and River, it became internal. The Barrismen started fighting amongst themselves in bloody, public battles for leadership, because leadership meant control of the money. In 2007, a battle within River's Barra at a motorway service station left one man, Gonzalo Acro, dead, shot in the head. This was a war for succession, fought with guns, over who got to control the support of a football team. This is the context for the night of May 14th, 2015. This wasn't just football, this was a war fought by proxies. The stage was continental, the Copa Libertadores, South America's Champions League. It was the second leg of the round of 16, the Superclásico on the world stage. River Plate had won the first leg 1-0 at their home, El Monumental. The second leg was at Boca's pulsating, terrifying home La Bombonera. The chocolate box was a vibrating wall of blue and yellow. Boca had to win. The pressure was, as always, unbearable. The first half was a tense, scoreless, brutal affair. 0-0. As the halftime whistle blew, River Plate were 45 minutes away from knocking their most hated rivals out of the continent's biggest competition on their own pitch. The humiliation was palpable. The River players walked towards the tunnel to go to the dressing room, showered in insults, and probably a few other things. They emerged 15 minutes later, back into the inflatable, accordion-like tunnel that shields players from the stands. They were walking, focused, ready to finish the job, and then a shadow appeared at the side of the plastic sleeve. A hand, a fan, a member of Boca's Barra, had sliced a hole in the tunnel from the outside. He lifted a canister and unleashed a chemical spray directly into the enclosed space, onto the river players. This wasn't just pepper spray, this was a quirky, fringe tidbit of pure malice. The spray was a homemade concoction, a cocktail of cayenne pepper, acidic chemicals, and who knows what else. It was designed to burn. It was an act of chemical warfare in a football match. The scenes that followed were apocalyptic. The river players stumbled out onto the pitch, choking, blinded, their eyes streaming. Leonardo Ponzio, their captain, was clawing at his face, his skin inflamed. Lionel Vangioni and others had visible red and orange chemical burns on their torsos and arms where the spray had soaked through their shirts. The match obviously was suspended, but the mayhem was just beginning. The river players were now trapped. They were on the pitch, in the centre circle, surrounded by 50,000 Boca fans who were in a state of absolute rabid fury. The fans didn't see a criminal act. They saw their rivals, the Gallinas, the Chickens, faking injury to get the match called off. They rained down bottles, coins, and anything else they could find onto the blinded, injured players and the officials. The Boca players, in a moment of utter disgrace, stood on the pitch and applauded their own fans, goading the River players, implying they were cowards. It took over 2 hours to get the River Plate team off the field. 2 hours of being held hostage on the pitch by the rival fans, while stadium officials and police tried to figure out a way to extract them without causing a full-scale riot. The attacker was eventually identified. He wasn't even a top-ranking Barra. He was a local baker, Adrian Napolitano, nicknamed El Panadero. The baker. The poison of the rivalry had seeped so deep it didn't even need the ringleaders anymore. The rank and file were happy to do the dirty work. The mainstream historical fact of this era of mayhem is what happened 3 years later in 2018. It was the final. The Copa Libertadores Final, the final of the century, Boca versus River. For the first time in history, they met to decide the championship of all of South America. The first leg, at Boca's home, was a 2-2 draw. The second leg was at River's El Monumental. This was it, the biggest game in the history of the sport, and it never happened. On the day of the match, the Boca Juniors team bus was ambushed by River fans on its way to the stadium. They smashed the windows with rocks, bottles, and pieces of wood. The police, in a moment of catastrophic incompetence, fired tear gas to disperse the crowd, but the gas went inside the bus, gassing the players. Several Boca players, including their captain, Pablo Perez, were rushed to the hospital with cuts to their eyes from the shattered glass. The match was, of course, postponed, and in the ultimate defining humiliation for Argentina, the country's football federation proved it could not host its own final. The match was moved to Madrid, Spain. The final of the century, the pinnacle of Argentine football, was played 6,000 miles away at the Santiago Bernabeu Stadium. Because the hatred in Buenos Aires was so total, so uncontrollable, it had finally literally driven the game itself into exile. The toxic, chemically burned and exiled passion of Buenos Aires dissolves. We leave the new world, with its wounds of class and corruption, and fly back to the old, back to Europe. But this is not the rain-slicked sectarianism of Glasgow. We are heading east, to the Balkans, to a city built on a strategic crossroads of rivers, a city that has been conquered, razed, and rebuilt more than 40 times in its history. We are in Belgrade, Serbia, and this city is home to the Vecchiti Derby, the eternal derby. This is a rivalry that was not born from ancient faith or immigrant class struggle. It was forged quite literally from the ashes of a world war by the decree of a new, triumphant and brutal political order. This is the story of Red Star and Partizan, a feud born from the ghost of a dead kingdom and the absolute power of a communist state. To understand the eternal derby, you must first understand Belgrade in 1945. The city was a ruin. It had been bombed by the Nazis in 1941, occupied, and then bombed again by the Allies in 1944, as they tried to dislodge the occupiers. In October 1944, the city was finally liberated, a joint operation by Josip Broz Tito's Communist Partisan Army and the advancing Soviet Red Army. The old kingdom of Yugoslavia was dead. A new socialist Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was being born from its bones. And like all new totalitarian regimes, the first order of business was to erase the past. This was a year zero project. Everything associated with the old bourgeois or royalist regime had to be purged. This included, of course, the city's beloved football clubs. The two great pre-war Belgrade teams were SK Yugoslavia and BSK Belgrade. They were successful, popular, and in the eyes of the new communist masters, ideologically tainted. So they were simply dissolved, liquidated. Their stadiums, their training grounds, their trophies, their entire history seized by the new state. They became ghosts, their legacies left hanging in the air. Into this vacuum, the new state created new clubs, symbols of the new order. In March 1945, just months after liberation, the mainstream historical fact of the derby's origin occurred. Crvena Zvezda, or Red Star Belgrade, was founded. It was formed by the United Alliance of Anti-Fascist Youth. This was to be the People's Club, the club of the new civil society, the university students, the anti-fascist movement. It was a broad, popular front, and as a reward, the state granted them the stadium, the grounds, and even the red and white colours of the freshly executed SK Yugoslavia. The old club was dead. Its skin was now worn by the new. 7 months later, in October 1945, a rival was created. This was not another People's Club. This was Partizan Belgrade. The name was not subtle. It was a direct, unambiguous homage to Tito's partisan fighters. This was the official, anointed, state-sponsored club of the Jugoslovenska Narodna Armia, JNA, the Yugoslav People's Army, and they, in turn, were handed the stadium and assets of the other great ghost, BSK Belgrade. The battle lines were drawn before a ball was ever kicked. This was not a rivalry of geography, faith, or class, at least not in the traditional sense. This was an institutional rivalry, baked into the very DNA of the new state. It was the Ministry of the Interior versus the Ministry of Defence. It was the people versus the army. It was Red Star versus Partizan. And because both clubs had the full, limitless backing of the state and the army, they immediately became the two dominant forces in Yugoslav football. All other clubs were reduced to mere satellites, orbiting these two Belgrade giants, who vacuumed up all the best players, all the resources, and all the media attention. The rivalry became the primary social, cultural, and emotional outlet in a tightly controlled, one-party state. You couldn't publicly criticise Tito. You couldn't form an opposition political party. You couldn't protest the state. But you could, twice a year, go to a stadium and scream your lungs out with 100,000 other people in a ritualised, state-sanctioned explosion of tribal passion. Analysts still debate whether Tito's regime actively encouraged this rivalry as a bread and circuses strategy, a pressure valve to keep the volatile Serbian youth occupied and divided, or if it was a genuine, organic sporting feud that the state simply learned to manage. Either way, it served a vital purpose. It kept the most passionate and therefore most dangerous segment of the population focused on a safe conflict. The fan groups that formed around this divide became legendary. Red Star's supporters, who congregated in the North Stand, the Seva, eventually consolidated under the name Delije, pronounced Delije. The name translates roughly to heroes, braves, or hard men. It has a romantic, almost mythic nationalist ring to it. They cultivated an identity of being the true heart of Belgrade, the passionate civil and slightly rebellious soul of Serbia. Partizan's fans in the South Stand, the Jug, were given a nickname by their rivals, Grobari, or the Gravediggers. This quirky, fringe tidbit has a few origin stories. The most common is that their black and white striped kits resembled the funereal uniforms of municipal gravediggers. Another suggests it was because their old stadium on Humska Street was near a cemetery. Whatever the origin, it was meant as an insult. And, in the grand tradition of football fans everywhere, the Grobari embraced it. Gravediggers? Fine, we will bury you. It perfectly suited their image as the tough, militant and uncompromising army club. For decades, this was the dynamic Delije versus Grobari, Red Star versus Partizan. It was intense, it was passionate, it was often violent, but it was contained. It was a domestic dispute, Managed by the iron hand of the Yugoslav state, the violence was usually confined to fists, rocks, and the occasional riot, horrific in its own right, but it was football violence. It was not yet political. Then, on May 4th, 1980, everything changed. Marshal Josip Broz Tito, the dictator who had held Yugoslavia together through sheer force of will for 35 years, died. The glue dissolved. The country he had built, a fragile federation of 6 republics, Serbia, Croatia, Bosnia, Slovenia, Macedonia, Montenegro, was a simmering pot of ancient ethnic and religious tensions that Tito had ruthlessly suppressed. Without him, the lid came off, the economy collapsed, and in the power vacuum a new dark force emerged: nationalism. In Serbia, figures like Slobodan Milosevic began to rise, stoking the fires of Serbian grievance, dreaming of a greater Serbia, and they looked for a place to find their army. They needed a pre-organised, loyal, passionate and violence-ready group of young men. They found them in the stadiums. The eternal derby began to change. The chants on the terraces of Red Star's Maracana Stadium, officially the Red Star Stadium but nicknamed after the Brazilian original, and Partizan's JNA Stadium were no longer just about the clubs. They became tinged with this new aggressive nationalism. The Delije at Red Star in particular became a focal point for this resurgent Serbian pride. The stadium became a political rally, and one man, a small-time gangster, owner of a pastry shop, and a known Delije, saw the opportunity of a lifetime. His name was Željko Rajnatović, but the world would come to know him by his nickname, Arkan. He began to organise the Delije, transforming them from a chaotic mob of fans into a disciplined paramilitary-style organisation. He was not just building a fan club, he was building an army. Željko Rajnatović, Arkan, was not just a fan. He was a career criminal, a jewel thief, a bank robber across Western Europe, and most importantly, a known and valued asset of the Yugoslav secret police, the UDBA. He was a patriotic gangster, the kind of man the state unleashed when it needed wet work done without a paper trail. He was, in short, the perfect man for a dark job, and the job, as the 1980s curdled into the 1990s, was to weaponize the most passionate, violent and nationalistic group in Serbia, the Delije. He didn't just join them, he unified them, using his fearsome reputation, his charisma, and his state backing to bring all the feuding sub-factions of the Seva under one, iron-fisted command. He turned a chaotic fan club into a disciplined, loyal to him, 3,000-strong street army. The stadium became his parade ground. The chants became his policy speeches. The eternal derby was a useful tool for stoking the flames. But the true defining moment of this new, terrifying fusion of football and nationalism came on May 13th, 1990. It was not an eternal derby. It was Red Star Belgrade versus Dinamo Zagreb, and it was the match that, for many, lit the fuse of the Yugoslav wars. This is the mainstream historical fact of the era. A day of infamy burned into the Balkan psyche. The match was in Zagreb, the capital of a Croatia that was itself boiling over with separatist nationalism. Arkan, now the undisputed leader of the Delije, personally led an organised excursion of the 500 of his most loyal men by train to the enemy's heartland. This was not a fan trip, it was a paramilitary operation. They were there to provoke. Hours before the match, the Delije, penned in their away section, chanted, "Zagreb is Serbian, and we will kill Tudjman," Croatia's new nationalist leader. They tore down advertisements, ripped up seats, and threw them at the Croatian fans, the Bad Blue Boys, who were just as rabidly nationalistic. The Bad Blue Boys, seeing the stadium they considered the heart of their new nation being destroyed by Serbs, finally broke through the laughably thin police cordon and charged onto the pitch, heading for the Delije. The police, who were still federal Yugoslav police but predominantly Serbian, responded with startling one-sided brutality. They savagely beat the Croatian fans who had stormed the pitch, while seemingly ignoring the provocations of the Delije. And then came the moment, frozen in time. Zvonimir Boban, Dinamo's captain and a Croatian hero, saw a police officer kicking a Dinamo fan who was on the ground. Enraged, Boban sprinted over and launched a perfect cinematic jump kick at the officer's chest. It was an act of open, televised rebellion against the Yugoslav state. The stadium descended into a full-scale war zone. The match was, of course, abandoned. Boban became a Croatian national icon. Arkan and his Delije, having successfully completed their mission of provocation, returned to Belgrade as heroes. The message was clear. The fight was no longer on the terraces, it was for the nation. When the war in Croatia began in earnest in 1991, Arkan had his recruitment list. He had his 3,000-strong, battle-hardened, fanatically loyal corps. The Delegé were the first to answer the call. In the bowels of the Red Star Stadium, the Maracana, the same place where Red Star was, almost surreally, on its way to winning the 1991 European Cup, the Champions League, the greatest triumph in its history, Arkan formed his paramilitary unit. It was officially the Serb Volunteer Guard, but the world would come to know them by their terrifying nickname, Arkanovi Tigrovi, Arkan's Tigers. This is the quirky and grotesque tidbit of the story. The Red Star Stadium literally became their military base. Arkan, a man who loved the theatre of it all, set up his headquarters in the offices beneath the stands. His men, in their new black uniforms, would drill on the club's training pitches. The club shop, where you could buy a team scarf or a replica shirt, became a de facto recruitment office. Young Delie, high on the fumes of nationalism and the glory of their club, would go from chanting in the Sever on Saturday to signing up for one of the most brutal ethnic cleansing units of the war on Monday. The Tigers were Arkan's private army. They were unleashed first in Croatia, in the brutal siege of Vukovar, and later in Bosnia. They were not soldiers, they were shock troops specialising in terror. They swept into towns like Bijeljina and Zvornik, cleansing them of non-Serbs. They were, by all credible accounts, a unit of murderers, looters and rapists, who videotaped their own atrocities. The men who, a year earlier, were just football hooligans, were now committing crimes against humanity. All in the name of a greater Serbia, and all under the banner of a man who had forged his army in the north stand of a football stadium. And what of Partizan's Grabari? Analysts still debate the extent of the Grabari's formal paramilitary involvement. They too were Serbian nationalists. Many Grabari did go to the front, but they tended to join other, more disparate nationalist units or the regular army, rather than being consolidated into a single, infamous brigade like the Tigers. Their leaders were, like Arkan, deep in the world of organised crime. But Arkan's Delegé were unique. They had the state protection, the single charismatic and sociopathic leader, and the direct, undeniable line of recruitment from the terrace to the trench. The war raged. Yugoslavia tore itself to pieces, and in Belgrade, under crippling international sanctions, the eternal derby continued. It was a bizarre, bleak spectacle. The stadiums were emptier, the football was poorer, but the hatred was, if anything, more real. The Delegé and Grabari were no longer just fighting each other for city bragging rights. They were rival criminal gangs, steeped in the real-world violence of the war. They were smuggling, dealing weapons, and fighting over the black market. The stadium became their fortress, a place to show strength and recruit new muscle. Arkan, in the meantime, became a grotesque celebrity. He was a war hero to radical Serbs, a pop culture icon who even married a famous turbo folk singer. In a final, surreal act of football-related villainy, he bought a small Belgrade club, FK Obilic, and led them to the 1998 league title. It was widely, and not very quietly, understood that opposing teams lost to Obilic because Arkan's Tigers would be sitting in the stands, or sometimes even visiting their locker rooms to make suggestions. It was perhaps the only time in sports history where a team's 12th man was a heavily armed death squad. Arkan was eventually indicted by the UN War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague, but before he could be arrested, he was assassinated, shot dead in the lobby of a Belgrade hotel in January 2000, a victim of the same criminal underworld he had helped create. He was a creature of the state, forged on the terrace and unleashed on a war. He was the man who proved, in the most sickening way possible, that football is not just a game. It is a container. And in the dying body of Yugoslavia, he had filled that container with ethnic hatred, nationalism, and blood. The grim, state-sponsored nationalism of Belgrade fades, leaving behind the taste of cold steel and ethnic cleansing. We fly west, to a city so ancient it seems to be made of gold and marble and chaos. We are in Rome, the eternal city, a place of breathtaking beauty and profound earthy historical cynicism. This city, which has seen the rise and fall of empires, which has housed popes and Caesars, is of course a football city. And its rivalry, The Derby della Capitale is not about class, nor is it truly about God. It is about history itself. It is about who gets to own the very idea of Rome. It is a battle between the wolf and the eagle, and it is a rivalry defined, shaped, and permanently poisoned by the ghost of one man, Benito Mussolini. To understand this feud, you must understand its strange lopsided birth. For the first quarter of the 20th century, Rome had several small neighbourhood clubs, but the capital, to the great embarrassment of the new fascist regime, had no sporting giant. The power of Italian calcio was in the industrial north, Juventus in Turin, the Milan clubs. Mussolini, a man obsessed with propaganda, symbols, and the restoration of Roman glory, could not abide this. He wanted a super club from the capital to challenge the north, a sporting arm of his new Roman Empire. So, in 1927, the regime acted. This is the mainstream historical fact of the derby's origin, as Roma was born via a state-mandated merger. The fascist government, through the party's local federation, forcibly fused the city's three main clubs, Alba Audace, Fortitudo Pro Roma, and Roman FC, into one. They were given the city's name, Associazione Sportiva Roma. They were given the city's colours, the deep imperial red and golden yellow, giallorossi. And they were given the city's founding myth as their crest, the lupa, the she-wolf nursing the twin founders, Romulus and Remus. Roma was, from its first breath, the club of the city. It was designed to be. It took root in the working-class heart of old Rome. In quarters like Testaccio, they were, and are, Roma. But there was one club that said no. One club that, through powerful, high-level connections, managed to resist the merger. Società Sportiva Lazio, founded 27 years earlier in 1900, was a broader athletic society, and one of its most powerful members was Generale Giorgio Vaccaro, a high-ranking fascist official. He successfully lobbied the regime to let his beloved Lazio remain independent, pure. This one act, this great refusal, drew the battle line for the next century. Lazio, whose symbol was the aquila, the imperial eagle, was now the other. It was the outsider. It was the club that wasn't Roma. From this, the fundamental insult was born. Roma fans, the Romanisti, looked at Lazio and saw a club that had no claim to the city. They saw them as outsiders, as country folk, as farmers. They called them the Barini, the Hicks from the surrounding region of Lazio, not the city of Rome. Lazio fans, the Laziali, developed a siege mentality in response. They looked back at Roma and saw an artificial state-created entity, a plastic club handed the city's symbols by a dictator. They saw themselves as the original club of the capital, the ones who had been there first. The derby became a bitter, endless argument over authenticity. Who is the true Roman? The wolf or the eagle? For decades, this was a fierce, passionate, but largely territorial dispute. The poison, the true disturbing element, seeped in during the 1970s. This was Italy's Anni di Piombo, the years of lead, a terrifying low-level civil war of political terrorism. Far-left groups like the Red Brigades and far-right neo-fascist groups were kidnapping, bombing and assassinating. The country was on the brink of collapse, and this ideological war spilled from the streets onto the curve, the terraces of the stadiums. In Rome, the battle lines were drawn. Roma's Curva Sud, South Curve, representing the People's Club from the working-class districts, adopted a strong left-wing, sometimes communist identity. And in response, Lazio's Curva Nord, North Curve, forever the other, forever the Barini mocked by the city, did the unspeakable. They made a conscious, deliberate and theatrical choice to become the ultimate villains. They embraced the extreme right. They embraced neo-fascism. This is the dark heart of the Derby della Capitale. Historians and sociologists still debate whether this mass adoption of fascist ideology by Lazio's ultras was a genuine, deep-seated political conviction or a form of performative extremity. Was it a calculated act of rebellion? A way to be the most hated, most anti-establishment, most other thing possible in a city that had rejected them? The truth is, it doesn't matter. The performance became the reality. Lazio's Curva Nord became a notorious symbol of neo-fascism in global sport. Their core ultra group, the Irreducibili, the Irreducibles, turned their stand into a shrine of hate. The Saluto Romano, the straight-armed fascist salute, became their signature greeting. Celtic crosses, a symbol of white power, became common, and most chillingly so did the swastika. Their racism became overt, with monkey chants aimed at black players a grimly regular feature of the derby. The banners were, and are, breathtaking in their depravity. Banners aimed at Roma's perceived association with the city's historic Jewish quarter. Auschwitz is your homeland, the ovens are your homes. Or, team of blacks, curve of Jews. This is not banter, this is not rivalry, this is the calculated use of genocide as a taunt. This brings us to the quirky, or in this case, simply grotesque tidbit of modern malice, the Anne Frank incident. In 2017, Irreducibili members, temporarily located in Roma's Curva Sud, their own stand was closed for racist chanting, left behind a present. They had printed hundreds of stickers showing a doctored image of Anne Frank, the young Jewish diarist murdered in the Holocaust wearing a Roma jersey. The message was clear: Roma, Jews, Anne Frank, to be exterminated. The incident caused a global wave of revulsion. In Italy, it was just another derby. This ideology was not just confined to the fans, it had its hero on the pitch. Paolo Di Canio, a brilliant, volatile and technically gifted forward, was a Lazial to his very core. He was a product of the Curva Nord, and he was, by his own admission, a fascist. In 2005, after scoring in a 3-1 derby victory, Di Canio ran to the Curva Nord and, in a moment of pure symbiotic ecstasy, gave a stiff-armed, unambiguous saluto romano to his people. He was fined, he was banned, and he was unrepentant. He was their icon, the man who brought their politics from the stands onto the grass. The Derby della Capitale is therefore a 90-minute ritual of political hatred. It's a place where the wolf and the eagle are just symbols for a much deeper, uglier fight. It's a city at war with itself, relitigating the 20th century, where half the stadium proudly cosplays as the very regime that, ironically, created their rivals. This level of ideological venom, this performance of pure hate, could not exist in a vacuum. It was only a matter of time before the symbols, the salutes, and the chants became something far more tangible. The stadium was a tinderbox, and in 1979 the first flare was lit. The tinderbox, as it turned out, was already burning. The political violence of the Anni di Piombo wasn't just a background hum, it was the daily soundtrack of Rome. Bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations were commonplace. The stadium, the Stadio Olimpico, was not an escape from this reality, it was its stage. It was the one place where the two opposing armies, the neo-fascists of the Curva Nord and the communists and far-leftists of the Curva Sud, could reliably find each other, in mass, twice a year. The derby by the late 1970s had become less a football match and more a pre-scheduled biannual street battle, with 70,000 witnesses. Fans arrived for the derby as if going to war. The pre-game atmosphere was a ritual cleansing by violence. Groups from both curve would hunt each other in the streets around the stadium, armed with clubs, chains, knives, and rudimentary explosives. The goal was less about supporting your team, and more about making sure the other team's fans required stitches before the opening whistle. This was the accepted, terrifying normal. It is October 28th, 1979. The Stadio Olimpico is packed, a vibrating, hostile mass of humanity. In the Curva Nord is Vincenzo Paparelli. He is 33 years old. He is a mechanic, an auto worker. He is a husband and a father of two. He is a Lazial. He is not an Irreducibili. He is not a neo-fascist ideologue. He is just a man, a regular fan, who has come to the derby with his wife, Wanda, to eat a sandwich, shout for his team, and take part in the city's great ritual. He is in his seat, in the packed terrace, waiting for the match to begin, the air already thick with smoke, insults, and the percussive sound of firecrackers. Across the stadium, in the Curva Sud, the heartland of the Romanisti, a small group of ultras is preparing their own artillery. This is the quirky, or in this case simply grotesque, tidbit of the story. They were not armed with simple handheld flares, the kind you wave to create a red mist. They were armed with razzi nautici, nautical distress flare pistols. These are in effect weapons. They are small-bore cannons designed to fire a thick metal-cased projectile hundreds of feet into the air with a powerful charge, to be seen for miles by rescue ships at sea. In the hands of an 18-year-old on a crowded terrace, they are mortars. Minutes before the game is set to start, a pop is heard from the Curva Sud. A young Roma ultra standing on the barrier aims one of these flare guns not up but across. He fires it horizontally. A thick red comet streaks across the 160-metre gap, separating the two curves. It flies on a low, flat, deadly trajectory, a missile of burning magnesium. The curva nord is a wall of unsuspecting targets. The projectile did not fall harmlessly. It did not expire in the air. It struck Vincenzo Paparelli directly in the face. The force of the impact was devastating. The flare, weighing almost a kilogram and travelling at high speed, struck him in the left eye. His wife, Wanda, was right next to him, holding the sandwiches. She heard what she described as a dull thud and turned to see her husband on the ground, a smoking 2-foot-long metal tube embedded in his head. The panic was instantaneous. The projectile had penetrated his skull, killing him almost instantly. Other fans, seeing the horrific scene, tried to help, but there was nothing to be done. He was carried out of the stands, the image of his body, with the red flare still protruding from his face, becoming a symbol of the Derby's descent into pure nihilistic hate. The news filtered through the stadium. The players, who were on the pitch warming up, were informed. They refused to play. An announcement was made over the loudspeaker. A fan has been gravely injured. The match is at risk. The stadium fell into a state of confused, agitated silence. And then, from the Curva Sud, a sound began to rise. The Roma fans, having learned that a Lazio fan had been killed by one of their own, began to chant. They weren't chanting in horror. They weren't chanting for their team. They were chanting about Paparelli, a chant that, in its cold simplicity, expressed a desire for more deaths. The rivalry, the political hatred, had so completely dehumanized the other side that the murder of a father in front of his wife was cause for celebration. The game was unbelievably eventually played. The authorities, fearing a full-scale riot and the complete breakdown of order in the city if 70,000 enraged people were unleashed at once, ordered the clubs to proceed. Roma won 2-1. It was, and is, the most hollow, cursed victory in the Derby's history. The hunt for the killer began. The mainstream historical fact is that Paparelli's death was the first ever fatality inside an Italian football stadium. It was a national trauma. The shooter was identified as Giovanni Fiorillo, an 18-year-old painter, a rank-and-file member of the Curva Sud. He had fled, disappearing into the city. For 14 months, he was a fugitive. He famously sent a letter to a newspaper claiming he was on a long holiday in Switzerland and didn't even know Paparelli was dead. He was eventually found hiding in a flat in Rome and arrested. He was convicted and served 7 years in prison, maintaining that he had not aimed at anyone, that he just fired the flare towards the sky. Analysts and sociologists still debate whether Paparelli's death was a black swan moment, a one-in-a-million tragedy of projectile physics, or the inevitable physical conclusion of the Anni di Piombo being played out on the terraces. Was it an accident, or was it the logical outcome of a war? When two sides, armed for battle, meet in an arena, the only surprise is that it hadn't happened sooner. The death of Vincenzo Paparelli did not chasten the rivalry. It did not bring a moment of clarity or shared grief. It did the opposite. It became a scar, and in football, scars are made to be weaponized. Just as the Grobari in Belgrade would sing of their rivals' tragedies, and River fans would mock the dead of Gate 12, the Romanisti ultras created a new, depraved songbook. Paparelli's name became a taunt. Banners appeared in subsequent derbies. Paparelli, you can't see this one, held aloft next to a lit flare. Chants of 10, 100, 1,000 Paparellis became part of the soundtrack. The Laziali in turn embraced their victimhood, becoming even more entrenched in their bitter siege mentality. The death of one of their own by a red and yellow wearing communist only proved their point. The city was against them, and it wanted them dead. The ideological war had claimed its first stadium victim. The political poison had done its work. But there are other poisons. We leave the marble ruins of Rome and the smoke of that fatal flare and head north. We go to a place of red brick, of rain, of shuttered factories and glorious defiant music. We head to a place where the rivalry was not born of faith, or class, or politics, but of something far more pragmatic and far more English: economics. It was a rivalry born from a ditch. a 36-mile-long ditch dug to steal a city's entire livelihood. The acrid smoke of Paparelli's signal flare and the spectral straight-armed salutes of the Stadio Olimpico begin to clear. We leave the ancient sun-baked marble of Rome and the ideological battlefields of Eastern Europe. We are heading north, back to the damp industrial heartland that first birthed the modern game. We're going to a place of red brick factories, of defiant music, of grey skies, and of a particularly stubborn poetic misery. We are in the northwest of England, and we are here to examine a rivalry born not of God, or class, or fascism, but of something far more practical, far more English, and perhaps far more bitter: money. This is the story of Liverpool and Manchester United, a story of two cities, 30 miles apart, bound by a shared history and divided by a 36-mile-long ditch that was dug out of pure, magnificent, industrial spite. To understand the bile that flows between these two red-clad giants, you must first forget about football. The game is just the container. The poison is much, much older. You have to go back to the 19th century, to the peak of the Industrial Revolution. This is when the world was being remade in smoke, and these two cities were its twin-cylinder engine. Manchester was Cottonopolis. It was the beating, churning heart of global industry, the first city of the machine age. Its factories and mills took raw cotton from America, and with a deafening 24-hour clatter, spun it into the fabric that clothed the entire British Empire. Manchester made the world's wealth. But Manchester had a problem. It was landlocked. To get its finished textiles out to the world and to get its raw cotton in, it had to rely on its neighbour 35 miles to the west, Liverpool. Liverpool was the gateway to the Atlantic. It was the second city of the empire, a title it shared begrudgingly with Glasgow. Its port, a sprawling revolutionary system of deep-water docks, was one of the most advanced and powerful on earth. And this is where the grudge began. Liverpool, with its total control of the port, held Manchester in a chokehold, and it squeezed. The Liverpool Corporation and the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board charged Manchester's merchants exorbitant fees, taxes and duties on every single bale of cotton that crossed their docks. Historians still debate whether this was just standard aggressive 19th century capitalism or a deliberate exploitative local tariff aimed at punishing their inland rivals. But to the men in Manchester, the cotton lords, it felt like extortion. It was, they felt, the lazy port city of Liverpool, a city of dockers and traders, getting rich off the real work, the sweat and the smog of Manchester's factories. This resentment festered for decades. Liverpool grew fat and arrogant, its waterfront a forest of masts, its magnificent Three Graces buildings a testament to its maritime wealth. Manchester just fumed and paid. Until, in the 1880s, a Manchester businessman named Daniel Adamson had an idea. It was an idea so insane, so audacious, and so colossally expensive that it bordered on fantasy. The idea was this: if Liverpool won't be reasonable, we will simply stop using them. We will bypass them. We will build our own port. And to do that, this landlocked city 36 miles from the sea would build a ditch. This is the mainstream historical fact that is the rivalry's original sin, the Manchester Ship Canal. It was a project of breathtaking spite. The plan was to dredge, blast and dig a 36-mile-long, 28-foot-deep waterway from the Mersey estuary, right past the edge of Liverpool and straight into the heart of industrial Manchester. It would be the longest river navigation canal in the world. It was in effect a declaration of economic war. The merchants of Liverpool laughed. They called it a castle in the air, a madman's fantasy that would bankrupt Manchester. They were wrong. It took 6 years, 17,000 labourers, and the excavation of 54 million cubic yards of earth. It cost $15 million, the equivalent of over $2 billion in modern money. It was an act of pure, stubborn industrial will. On January 1st, 1894, the Manchester Ship Canal opened. Queen Victoria officially christened it later that year, sailing down its length in the royal yacht, and in doing so she knighted the new port of Manchester. It was now, officially, Britain's third busiest port despite being 36 miles from the coast. The effect on Liverpool was not gradual, it was immediate and it was catastrophic. The trade that was once Liverpool's birthright simply vanished. It steamed right past them, up the new canal. The Liverpool docks fell quiet. The warehouses emptied. Tens of thousands of Liverpool dockers, the Scousers, a name derived from lobscouse, their cheap stew, were thrown out of work. Their families starved. Their city's economic spine had been snapped deliberately by their nearest neighbour. This was not a rivalry. This was a trauma, an act of theft that would never be forgotten or forgiven. And here is the quirky fringe tidbit, a permanent, threaded insult. Look at the crest of Manchester United. Right in the centre, on the shield, is a ship in full sail. This is not a generic boat. It is a symbol of the Manchester Ship Canal, the very ditch that devastated their rivals. It is a permanent embroidered celebration of that original act of economic warfare, worn over the heart of every player who steps on the pitch. For decades, this hatred was just a low civic hum. The football clubs, Liverpool FC and Manchester United, born as Newton Heath, a team of railway workers, were not even the biggest in their own towns. Liverpool had Everton, United had Manchester City. But as the 20th century wore on, the fortunes of the two cities began to mirror each other. The industries that had built them, cotton and shipping, were both in terminal decline. By the 1970s and 80s, both cities were on their knees. They were wastelands of post-industrial decay, plagued by mass unemployment, urban deprivation, and a heroin epidemic. They were the poster children for Britain's managed decline, looked down upon by a prosperous London-centric South. They were two cities, identical in their misery, their pride, their defiant spirit, their sharp wit, and their world-changing music, and they hated each other. They hated each other because they were so similar. They were two bald men fighting over a comb, and their only outlet, their only source of global pride was football. This is when the rivalry truly ignited. As Matt Busby built United's first great team, and then as Bill Shankly and Bob Paisley built Liverpool into a European dynasty that dominated the 70s and 80s, the football match became the proxy battle. It was the one day a year their city could be better than the other. When Alex Ferguson arrived at a destitute Manchester United in 1986, he famously said his one goal was to knock Liverpool right off their fucking perch. He wasn't just talking about the league table, he was talking about restoring the civic, economic and cultural dominance that Manchester felt was its birthright. The dominance Liverpool's football team had stolen, just as Manchester's canal had stolen their port. The hatred became about dominance. It was a zero-sum game. One success was the other's total, abject humiliation. The chants from the terraces weren't just about the score, they were about poverty. Sign on with a pen in your hand," the United fans would sing, mocking Liverpool's rampant unemployment. It was a direct, vicious, economic taunt. The rivalry was no longer about a canal built 100 years ago. It was about now. It was about who was the bigger victim, who was the truer soul of the North. But this deep, economic and cultural wound, this shared history of decline and victimhood, was about to curdle into something truly, unspeakably dark. This is where the story turns, where it stops being about the past, about canals dug and trophies won, and becomes about something far uglier, more personal and more profane. The rivalry, built on the solid bedrock of mutual economic destruction and fueled by a desperate 70-year-long battle for sheer dominance, had poisoned the well. When two cities, so identical in their pride and their suffering, are locked in a zero-sum game, any weapon is permissible. And the most effective weapon, the one that cuts the deepest, is not to mock your rival's failures, but to mock their grief. This is the era of tragedy chanting. A race to the absolute bottom of the human soul, where the most sacred, traumatic and defining moments of a club's history are turned into a sing-along taunt. To understand this, you must understand the two pillars of trauma that define these clubs. For Manchester United, that pillar is a sheet of ice in West Germany. It is February 6th, 1958, the Munich air disaster. Matt Busby's Busby Babes were the future of English football, a breathtakingly brilliant young homegrown team that was poised to conquer Europe. On their way back from a European Cup match in Belgrade, the irony, their plane stopped to refuel in a snowy Munich. Twice they tried to take off, twice they failed. On the third attempt, the plane ploughed through a slushy runway, crashed through an airport fence and struck a house. The aircraft was torn to pieces. 23 people died, 8 of them were players. Duncan Edwards, the greatest English talent of his generation, died 15 days later. The team was, in an instant, obliterated. Busby himself was read his last rites twice, but survived. Munich is not just an event in United's history. It is the event. It is their founding myth, their martyrdom. The club's entire modern identity is built on the ashes of that runway. For Liverpool, the pillar of trauma is a steel fence in Sheffield. It is April 15th, 1989, the Hillsborough disaster. 97 men, women and children went to an FA Cup semi-final and never came home. They were crushed to death in the overcrowded, lethally designed pens of the Leppings Lane end, the victims of a catastrophic failure and cover-up by the South Yorkshire police. This is the mainstream historical fact of this rivalry's modern poison. Hillsborough is not just a club tragedy, it is a civic one. It is a defining moment of trauma, loss, and a 30-year, gut-wrenching, soul-crushing fight for justice against a state and a media establishment, led by the Sun newspaper, that lied and blamed the victims, claiming they were drunken, ticketless animals who had killed their own. These are the two wounds, the open, weeping generational traumas of two great cities. And in the 1990s and 2000s, as the rivalry reached its peak toxicity, the fans of each side picked up the salt. It began with Munich. For decades, a minority of Liverpool fans, and fans of other clubs like Leeds United, had taunted United with the crash. They would make airplane gestures, arms outstretched, diving to the ground. They would sing to the tune of, "Who's that knocking at the window? Who's that dying on the runway? Who's that lying in the snow? It's Matt Busby and his boys making all the fucking noise." It was and is an act of pure, calculated depravity. An attempt to reduce the defining, sainted tragedy of their rival to a sick joke. United fans faced with this did not rise above. They dug down, they went for Hillsborough, and their taunts were, if possible, even more insidious. They didn't just mock the deaths, they mocked the 30-year fight for justice. They would sing, "The Sun was right, you're murderers. Always the victims, it's never your fault." These chants were a direct political and venomous assault, aligning the chanters with the police cover-up, with the establishment lies, with the very forces that had smeared a city in its deepest moment of grief. They would make pushing gestures, mocking the fatal crush. Commentators and sociologists still argue whether this tragedy chanting is a new phenomenon, a product of a desensitized internet age where nothing is sacred, or if it's simply the logical verbal endpoint of a rivalry built on total economic and cultural warfare. Is it just banter gone wrong? Or is it a symptom of a profound sociopathy, a total dehumanization of the other? This, of course, was not the only trauma to weaponize. In 1985, at the European Cup final at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels, charging Liverpool fans had caused a wall to collapse, killing 39 Juventus fans. This was Liverpool's shame, as opposed to Hillsborough, their grief. For United fans, this was a gift. "We're not murderers, unlike you," became a common refrain. The lines became blurred. The murderer tag from Heysel was deliberately conflated with the "you killed your own lie" from Hillsborough. This descent into moral nihilism created its own grim culture. The quirky, or in this case grotesque, tidbit is the evolution of the Munich timer gesture. Manchester United fans, particularly under Alex Ferguson, were famous for getting late match-winning goals in Fergie time. Their fans and players would often point to their watches, a gesture of dominance. In response, a depraved section of Liverpool fans co-opted the gesture. They too would point to their watches, and then they would outstretch their arms, making the airplane gesture, a double entendre of pure malice. Time's up, a reference to the fatal crash. The rivalry is no longer about a canal. It is no longer just about the league table. It has become a sickening competitive inventory of trauma. You mock our dead, we mock yours. You sing about Munich, we sing about Hillsborough. You call us murderers, we call you the same. It is an endless, recursive, ugly argument about whose grief is more real and whose tragedy is more mockable. It's a rivalry that has stared so long into the abyss that it has forgotten why it was even looking. But what if the rivalry isn't with the club across town? What if it's not even with the club 30 miles away? What if the real rival, the true other, is the state, the police, the government itself? What happens when the stadium is no longer a place for sport, but the last and only fortress of political revolution? For that, we must leave the damp, grey north of England and travel to a land of ancient dust, of pyramids and of a revolution that was born on the terraces. The bleak, self-consuming hatred of the Northwest Derby, with its grim inventory of mocked tragedies, fades into the cold English rain. We leave it behind, travelling south and east, across the Mediterranean, to a place of ancient baked earth history. We're going to a city of 100 million people, a sprawling, chaotic, vibrant and choking metropolis. We are in Cairo, Egypt, a city that throbs with a revolutionary energy, and we're here for a derby that is not about class or God or economics. We are here for a rivalry that became so powerful, so organised, and so symbolic of a wider struggle that it helped to topple a 30-year dictatorship. This is the Cairo Derby, Ahly versus Zamalek, and this is the story of the ultras, the fans who went to war not with each other, but with the state. The rivalry itself is old. It's the Derby of the Nile, and it splits the entire country and much of the Arabic-speaking world in two. Ahly, the national, was founded in 1907. As its name suggests, it was the club of Egyptian nationalism, of the anti-colonial movement, of the students and intellectuals who wanted to throw off the yoke of British influence. Their colours are the red of the pre-colonial Egyptian flag. They are the Red Devils. They are and have always been seen as El Shab, the People's Club. Their rival, Zamalek, founded in 1911, had a different birth. It was originally called Castre el Nil, Palace of the Nile, and was founded by a Belgian lawyer. Its early membership was dominated by Europeans and the mixed Egyptian elite. This is the mainstream historical fact of the feud's origin. Ahly was the club of the nationalist insiders. Zamalek was the club of the pro-British, royalist outsiders. Even after its name was changed and it was Egyptianized, this identity stuck. They were the club of the monarchy, of the wealthy, of the establishment, the White Knights. For 100 years, this was the dynamic. It was a massive, passionate, all-consuming rivalry, but a traditional one. People's Club versus Royal Club. It was the entire country's national pastime. But then, in the mid-2000s, something new and dangerous arrived in Egypt, the Ultra movement. In 2007, two groups were born, inspired by the Tifos of Italy and the passion of Argentina. From Ahly came Ultras Alawi, UA07. From Zamalek came Ultras White Knights, UBK07. And they emerged into the Egypt of Hosni Mubarak. Mubarak's Egypt was a 30-year-old police state. It was a pressure cooker of corruption, of stagnant politics, of mass youth unemployment, and of brutal, routine, sadistic police torture, most infamously practiced by the Amn al-Dawla, the state security forces. In Mubarak's Egypt, the right to assembly was non-existent. You could not gather. You could not protest. You could not even meet in a group of 5 people without attracting the attention of the secret police. There was one, and only one, exception. One place where the state, for its own bread and circus's purposes, allowed 100,000 angry, disaffected, unemployed young men to gather, to organise, to chant and to scream, the Cairo International Stadium. The Ultras, both Alawi and White Knights, became the most powerful, organised and truly independent civil society groups in the entire country. They were a state within a state. They had hierarchical structures, initiation rites, and a code of absolute silence and anonymity, the mentality. They wore hoodies and masks not just to look intimidating, but to hide from the state's cameras. They developed their own art, the tifos, massive, stadium-wide banners of incredible complexity. This is the quirky, fringe tidbit. Their tifos and their songs were not just about football, they were complex, coded, allegorical attacks on the regime. They were, in effect, the only uncensored political cartoons in Egypt. Their real rivalry, their true eternal derby, was not with each other. It was with the police. The stadium became their liberated zone, the one place in all of Egypt where they could fight back, and they did. Every match was a running, pitched battle between the ultras, both sets, and the black-clad, riot shield-wielding central security forces. The police, who brutalised them in the streets all week, were met inside the stadium with rocks, flares, and a level of organised military-style resistance they had never encountered. The ultras were, in short, training. Commentators and political analysts still debate whether the ultras were truly a political football movement that was forced into revolution by police oppression, or if they were an inherently political pro-democracy movement that simply used football as its cover. The ultras themselves insisted on the former. Their slogan was, "We are not political," but their greatest, most famous chant, screamed by 50,000 Ahly in unison, was a direct political threat. "Oh government, you are so unjust. Oh police officer's name, you dog, just wait for me. If you are a man, come to the stadium. We will sing until the oppression is gone." Then, on January 25th, 2011, the call went out. The Arab Spring had come to Egypt. Pro-democracy activists called for a day of rage in Cairo's Tahrir Square. The activists were brave, but they were activists. They were students, lawyers, bloggers. They were not street fighters. The police, they knew, would crush them in an hour. The ultras at first were hesitant. This was politics, not football, but the regime, in a panic, shut down the football league. The ultras had nowhere to go, and their mortal enemy, the Amn al-Dawla, was on the streets beating the protesters. The choice was made. On January 28th, the Friday of Rage, the ultras arrived in Tahrir, and they arrived organised. Ultras Alawi and Ultras White Knights, the two most bitter rivals in the country, marched into the square not as enemies, but as a single, unified, battle-hardened army. And they saved the revolution. When Mubarak's regime unleashed its last desperate weapon, the Battle of the Camel, a charge of thugs on horses and camels, backed by plainclothes police, it was the ultras who held the line. They were the front line. They used their stadium tactics. They organised defences. They set up field hospitals. They knew how to fight the police. They had been doing it for fun every weekend for 4 years. They were the only group in Egypt who were not afraid of the Ministry of Interior. They broke the police, they held the square, and 18 days later, Hosni Mubarak was gone. The fans had toppled a dictator. They were the heroes of the revolution, celebrated by all. But they had made an enemy. Not just Mubarak, but the entire deep state he represented. The police, the military, the Amn al-Dawla. They had been humiliated on the world stage by a group of football fans. And the police in particular were not the forgiving type. They were patient, they were vindictive, and they knew exactly where to find the ultras. They knew where their liberated zone was. The fans had won the battle. But the war, the real, bloody war, was just beginning. And the state was coming for its revenge. The cheers from Tahrir Square, the celebrations of a toppled dictator, now seemed like a distant, naive echo. The ultras, Alawi and White Knights, side by side, were the undisputed heroes of the revolution. But revolutions have a nasty habit of eating their young. And the deep state, the vast, shadowy and humiliated apparatus of the military and the Ministry of Interior, MOI, was not defeated. It was just waiting. It had been embarrassed by a bunch of kids in hoodies, and an institution built on fear and brutality does not forget. It does not forgive. The Football League, suspended during the uprising, had resumed, but the air was different. It was no longer a game, it was a Cold War, and the police were waiting for their moment. That moment arrived on February 1st, 2012. It wasn't even the Cairo Derby. It was a routine midweek league match in a grim provincial port city. Al-Ahly, the People's Club, the champions of the revolution, travelled to Port Said to play the local team, Al-Masri. Port Said is a city with its own hard-bitten identity, a tough insular place, often resentful of Cairo's dominance. The police presence for a game involving Al-Ahly and their massive, famously anti-police ultras was thin, ominously, unnaturally thin. The stadium was a known tinderbox. The local Al-Masri, Green Eagles ultras were notoriously violent, and yet security was almost non-existent. The match itself was a farce of escalating dread. The Al-Masri fans were allowed to storm the pitch not once but twice during the game to celebrate goals. They ran right up to the Al-Ahly players. The police, the few who were visible, just stood and watched. They formed no cordons, they made no arrests. They were statues in black. The Al-Ahly players were terrified. Their legendary star, Mohamed Abu Trika, pleaded with the referee to stop the match. The referee refused. The Al-Ahly fans, the Ultras Ahlawi, penned in their small away section, began to chant, not at the Al-Masri fans, but at the military council now ruling Egypt. Down with the military. They knew instinctively that this was not a football match, it was a trap. The final whistle blew, a shock result. Al-Masri had won 3-1, and in that exact preordained second, the trap was sprung. From the Al-Masri stands, a torrent of thousands of men poured onto the field. They were not celebrating, they were armed. They carried knives, clubs, stones, bottles, swords, and pieces of rebar. And they were not running randomly. They ran in a single coordinated wave, a disciplined military formation, straight for the Al-Ahly supporters, 200 yards away at the far end of the stadium. This is the mainstream historical fact that makes Port Said not a riot, but a massacre. The police did 3 things. First, they did nothing to stop the charge. They simply stepped aside, opening a channel for the attackers. Second, they sealed the Al-Ahly fans' exit. A large steel gate at the bottom of their terracing, their only escape route to the street, was locked, chained, and barred. The ultras were now in a concrete pen, a killing box. Third, just as the attack began, the stadium lights were cut, plunging the entire scene into a terrifying pitch-black chaos, lit only by the green flares of the Al-Masri attackers. What followed was 30 minutes of medieval butchery. The ultras Ahlawi, the heroes of Tahrir, were trapped. They were attacked from the front by the armed mob and crushed from behind by the sheer hydraulic panic of their own comrades trying to flee an exit that would not open. They were stabbed. They were clubbed. They were thrown, one by one, from the top tier of the stadium, falling 40 feet to the concrete below. The attackers moved with a chilling, systematic precision. Survivors reported that the attackers knew exactly who to target, bypassing regular fans to find the known Alawi capos, or leaders. The Al-Ahly players, fleeing to their dressing room, were attacked. Their retired legend, Manuel José, the most successful manager in the club's history, was kicked and beaten by police officers. In the dressing room, a scene from a war hospital. The players, huddled in terror, watched as their own fans, young men who idolized them, were carried in, dying. This is the grotesque, heartbreaking tidbit of the night. Mohammed Abu Trika, the sainted, beloved star of all Egypt, held a young fan in his arms. The boy looked up at him and said, I was just in the stands. And then he died. Abu Trika, in a state of shock, grabbed a phone and called Al-Ahly's TV station, live on air. His voice was breaking, screaming, "This is not football, this is a war. People are dying in front of us. Where is the army? Where is security? They are leaving us to die." The final toll was horrific. 74 people dead. 90% of them were ultras Alawi. Many were teenagers. Hundreds more were injured. It was the darkest day in the history of Egyptian sport, and one of the worst stadium disasters in global history. But it was not a disaster. It was, as the ultras insist to this day, a state-orchestrated execution. Analysts and human rights organisations still debate the precise level of premeditation, whether it was a meticulously planned hit by the central MOI and military leadership to break the ultras as a political force, or a catastrophic, localised failure where a vindictive, on-the-ground police force allied with local thugs to teach the ultras a lesson. But the evidence, the locked gates, the absent security, the coordinated attack, the stadium lights, the police non-intervention is overwhelming. The attackers were heard chanting a simple, chilling refrain. This is the price of the revolution. The ultras who thought they were men are dead. It was a message sent in blood from the deep state. We are back. Your revolution is over, and we will kill you on camera in your own liberated zone, and we will get away with it. The Football League was suspended for 2 years. The ultras, both Alawi and White Knights, who in a moment of solidarity formed a protective guard for the Alawi survivors returning to Cairo, were shattered. They were now officially enemies of the state. They were hunted, arrested, banned, and designated as terrorist organisations. The stadium, their fortress of rebellion, had been turned into their tomb. The state, having lost the Battle of Tahrir Square, had won the war, using a provincial football match as its execution ground. The cold, calculated political murder at Port Said leaves a scar on the soul. It is the grim endpoint of a rivalry that became a revolution, and a revolution that was met with state-sanctioned slaughter. The silence from that Egyptian dressing room, the ghost of that young boy in Abu Trika's arms, is a hard one to shake. But our journey, this long night's tour of human darkness, must find its end. We fly north, across the Mediterranean, to a city that is not just a city, but a crossroads. A place that is literally 2 worlds at once. We are in Istanbul, Turkey, the city that straddles the Bosphorus, the city that is both Europe and Asia, and we are here for the Kıtalar Arası Derby, the Intercontinental Derby. A rivalry that is not about geography, it is geography. It is the physical, tectonic embodiment of a cultural divide, a 90-minute battle for the soul of a city that has two. This is the story of Galatasaray and Fenerbahce, and to understand it, you must first understand the Bosphorus, the strait of water that slices the city in two. It is not a river, it is a continental boundary. On the west side, you are in Europe, on the east side, you are in Asia. The rivalry is that simple and that profound. Galatasaray, the mainstream historical fact of the feud's origin, was born in 1905 on the European side. It was founded by Ali Sami Yen and his fellow students from the Galatasaray Lycée, one of the most elite, prestigious and old-world imperial high schools in the Ottoman Empire. It was a French-speaking, Western-facing aristocratic institution. The club, therefore, became the symbol of European Istanbul. They were the elite, the bourgeoisie, the snobs with their continental manners and their refined classical education. Their colours are red and yellow, their nickname Aslanlar, the Lions, and their home and their identity is Europe. 2 years later, in 1907, a rival was born across the water, on the Asian side, in the sprawling working-class district of Kadıköy. This was Fenerbahce, named for a local lighthouse on the shore. This club became the antithesis of Galatasaray. This was the People's Club, Halkın. This was the club of the Anatolian heartland, of the dockers, the shopkeepers, the true Turks, as they saw it. They were the Sarı Kanaryalar, the Yellow Canaries, their colours yellow and navy blue. They were Asia, and so the battle line was drawn, not by religion, or class, or politics, but by the saltwater of the Bosphorus. Every match is a symbolic collision of continents. It's an argument about identity. What is Istanbul? Is it the refined European city of the past, or is it the sprawling, passionate Anatolian city of the future? This rivalry, like the Old Firm and the Superclásico, quickly devoured its domestic league. They are the two great warring giants of the Super League, vacuuming up the majority of titles and the vast majority of the nation's 85 million fans. You are either red and yellow, or you are yellow and blue. There is no middle ground. And the passion is not just passion, it is an inferno. The quirky, fringe tidbit that defines this rivalry for the world is the concept of hell. Galatasaray's old stadium, the Ali Sami Yen, was a small, crumbling, terrifying bowl of noise. It was there that their ultra group, the Ultraslan, perfected the art of psychological warfare. They greeted visiting teams with a sea of fire, thousands of flares held aloft creating a red and yellow mist of pure sulphurous hate. Banners in English were unfurled, "Welcome to Hell." When Manchester United in 1993 were knocked out of the Champions League there, their players spoke of the experience not as a football match, but as a sensory assault, a 90-minute riot they were lucky to escape. This is the atmosphere Ultraslan and Fenerbahce's Genç Fenerbahçeliler, GDB, try to replicate every single time they meet. The violence is not a possibility. It is a guarantee. This is a rivalry of flares used as weapons, fired like missiles from one end of the stadium to the other. It is a rivalry of ripped-up seats, of knives, of pre-planned 500-man battles in the backstreets of Taksim Square or the ferry terminals of Kadıköy. The Bosphorus itself becomes a battleground, the rival fans, separated by water, launching insults and projectiles at each other's ferries as they make the crossing. Commentators and Turkish sociologists still debate whether this Europe-Asia divide is the real driver of the hatred, or if it's just a convenient romanticised hook for what is, at its core, a classic urban rivalry between two co-dominant superclubs. Does the average Ultraslan really feel European, or does he just despise the colour blue? Does the GDB member feel Asian, or does he just want to win the league? The geography, in the end, is just the excuse. It's the permission slip for the primal tribal need to identify an other and despise them. Sometimes this hatred is concentrated into a single immortal act. In 1996, the Turkish Cup final was played, over 2 legs between the two. Galatasaray won, and the second decisive leg was played at Fenerbahce's home, the Şükrü Saracoğlu Stadium. The manager of Galatasaray was Graham Souness. Souness, a famously hard, uncompromising, and let's be honest, a little unhinged Scotsman, had been under immense pressure. A Fenerbahce director had months earlier publicly mocked him, calling him a cripple after he'd had heart surgery. Souness remembered. As his players celebrated winning the cup on their enemy's soil, Souness grabbed a giant red and yellow Galatasaray flag. He ran by himself to the centre circle of the pitch, and in a moment of the most glorious, suicidal and legendary act of provocation in sports history, he planted the flag deep into the centre spot, like a conqueror claiming the enemy's castle. A full-scale riot erupted. Fenerbahce fans stormed the pitch, their one goal to tear Souness limb from limb. He was bundled away by police, smiling. He became Ulubatlı Souness to the Gala fans, a hero named after Ulubatlı Hasan, the Ottoman soldier who famously planted the flag on the walls of Constantinople. To Fenerbahce fans, he remains the ultimate symbol of their humiliation. This passion, this hell, has a lethal, non-symbolic edge. In 2000, 2 Leeds United fans, Christopher Loftus and Kevin Spite, were stabbed to death in Taksim Square by Galatasaray fans the night before a UEFA Cup semi-final. In 2013, a 19-year-old Fenerbahce fan, Burak Yildirim, was stabbed to death on a bus on his way home from the derby. He wasn't stabbed by a Gala fan. He was stabbed in an argument by another Fenerbahce fan. The culture of violence had become so normalised, so total, that it had begun, quite literally, to consume itself. From the sectarian reign of Glasgow to the class war of Buenos Aires, from the nationalist ghosts of Belgrade to the fascist salutes of Rome, from the economic spite of Manchester to the revolutionary blood of Cairo, and now to the continental divide of Istanbul. We have seen that football, o jogo bonito, is a lie. Or at least it is a half-truth. It is a beautiful game, yes, but it is also a container, a perfect hollow vessel that we, in our infinite desperate tribal need, fill with our oldest, darkest and most disturbing poisons: God, class, politics, geography, and simple, ugly, murderous spite. The stadium is not a sanctuary. It is a mirror, and what we see in it, so often, is the very worst of ourselves. And so, our long night's journey comes to its close. The last flare has fizzled out over the Bosphorus, its red smoke drifting away into the dark, joining the ghosts of Port Said, the spectral salutes of Rome, and the cold, damp mist rising from the ship canal. The stadiums, those vast concrete cauldrons of our collective rage, are finally empty. The chants have faded, leaving only the echo. The turnstiles are locked. The ghosts of Stairway 13, of Gate 12, of Heysel and Hillsborough and Port Said are alone on the terraces, in the silence. All that manufactured, primal, week-long hatred has been spent, and the city for a few hours sleeps. These stories, these wounds, are deep, but they are just stories. They are just the past, and you are here, now, safe in your room. The only sound is the soft hum of the fan, the only light, the one you choose. There is no enemy here. There are no colours, no tribes. There is only the quiet and the approaching gentle relief of sleep.